Have you ever stopped to think about the quiet moments when you're alone? Just you and the child in your care. What if I told you that in those still, seemingly peaceful moments, there's something invisible, watching, waiting, just beyond your sight? You've probably heard the whispers of others, stories passed down through the years, tales of strange occurrences in the homes of unsuspecting babysitters. But what if these stories were more than just legends? What if they were true? Imagine yourself in a quiet house. The air is still. You're alone in the living room, the child you're looking after fast asleep in their room. The only sound is the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Then, from the corner of your eye, you see it. A shadow, too brief to catch, but enough to make your heart skip a beat. You glance around, but there's no one there. The house is silent again, almost too silent. But it's not the silence that's unsettling. It's the presence, the feeling that you're being watched, that someone or something is lurking just out of reach, hiding in the shadows. Something you can't see, but you can feel. That gnawing sense that you're no longer alone in this space. Stay with me, because you'll hear 3 stories. 3 true accounts of babysitters who experienced this terror firsthand, and I promise you, none of them will leave you with the same comfort you started with. It was a calm, quiet night. The babysitter, a young woman in her early 20s, had taken a simple job looking after a well-behaved child in a suburban home. The night had started just like any other. The child, a boy around 8 years old, was already tucked into bed, and the sitter was lounging in the living room, flicking through TV channels. The house was still. There were no sounds, no signs of anything unusual, just the soft glow of the television and the occasional rustle of the trees outside as the wind blew through the branches. But then, the phone rang. It was a landline, and the sudden sound of the ringer pierced the silence of the house like a knife. The babysitter hesitated for a moment, her heart skipping a beat. Who could it be at this hour? She picked up the receiver, her fingers trembling slightly, thinking it was probably just the parents checking in. "Hello," she answered, her voice steady, but with a hint of uncertainty. There was a long pause, a silence that stretched out uncomfortably, before a voice finally spoke. "Are you alone with the child?" The voice was low, distorted, almost as though it were coming from behind a mask, distant and cold. The babysitter's pulse quickened, but she dismissed it as a prank. "Yes, I'm alone," she said firmly, trying to shake off the unease creeping up her spine. "Who is this?" But the line went dead. She shook her head, trying to calm herself. Just a prank. Probably some kids playing around, she thought. She set the receiver back in its cradle and tried to focus on the TV, but something about the call unsettled her. Why would someone ask such a question? It wasn't normal. Minutes passed. Just as she began to let her guard down, the phone rang again. This time, her heart raced before she even picked up. She grabbed the receiver but didn't say anything immediately. The line was silent, the kind of quiet that made her stomach tighten. Then, that same distorted voice returned. "Are you alone with the child?" it asked again, as if the question itself held some kind of hidden meaning. A chill ran down the babysitter's spine. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The voice sounded familiar, like it was somehow closer, and this time there was no mistaking the feeling of dread that swept over her. She slammed the phone down, but it rang once more, louder this time. Desperately, she picked up the receiver and heard the same voice again, distorted and cold. "Are you alone with the child?" the voice repeated, almost mechanically. Her stomach churned. She glanced over at the child's room, wondering if he was still sleeping soundly. The house seemed eerily quiet, too quiet. She began to pace, her mind racing, but the unsettling voice wouldn't let her forget. Her heart sank as the third call came through just moments later. The same question, the same voice, but this time it sounded different. This time it wasn't just a question, it was an accusation. "You shouldn't be alone with him," the voice said, and then there was a strange crackling sound on the line, like static, but far worse, as if something was being distorted on the other side. As she listened, she realized something disturbing. The voice seemed to know intimate details about the child. It knew the boy's name. It knew what room he was in. It even knew about the toy truck he was playing with earlier. And then the house fell silent. For a brief moment, she tried to shake off the dread crawling up her back. She looked at the clock. 2:30 a.m. She had to check on the child. She rushed upstairs to his room, her heart hammering in her chest. But when she opened the door, the room was eerily quiet. She moved quickly to the window, expecting to find him asleep. But what she saw made her blood run cold. There, standing by the window, was the child. But he wasn't looking at her. He was staring out into the dark, moonless night. His back was to her, his small frame motionless. "They're here," the child whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're here." A surge of panic flooded her. "Who's here?" she asked, trying to get him to turn around. But he didn't respond. He just kept staring out the window, as if he could see something or someone outside in the dark. The babysitter's breathing became shallow as she backed away from the window. The room felt colder. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move with an unnatural fluidity. Then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of a door creaking. It was coming from downstairs. Her blood ran cold as she realized something. The door hadn't been opened before. The parents had locked it when they left. She rushed to the door, but before she could even reach it, the phone rang once again. She didn't want to answer. She knew who it was, but she had to know what was happening. Trembling, she picked up the receiver. "Are you alone with the child?" The voice asked again, this time with a chilling finality. But then the voice changed. It wasn't distorted anymore. It was clearer now. The voice was calm, chillingly calm, and it sent a wave of terror through her as it spoke again. "We're inside," the voice said. "We're in the house with you." It was supposed to be an easy night, a late-night babysitting job in a quiet suburban neighborhood, no different from the hundreds of others she'd taken before. The parents seemed kind enough, giving their usual instructions to the babysitter as they left for a night out. The house was modest, the kind you'd expect to see tucked away in a neighborhood that seemed as ordinary as could be. The house was dimly lit, the soft hum of the TV filling the silence as the child, a little girl no older than 6, sat on the couch watching her favorite cartoon. The babysitter settled in, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was already past midnight. She thought about preparing a snack for herself, something to help pass the time. But there was a strange sense of stillness that she couldn't shake off, a feeling that seemed to hang in the air like thick smoke. She tried to push it aside, focusing instead on the child, who seemed perfectly content. The room felt too quiet, too still for her liking, and the ticking of the clock on the wall grew louder in her ears. The child, sitting motionless, suddenly spoke. "I don't want to be alone with her anymore." The words, soft but clear, made the babysitter freeze in her tracks. She looked at the girl, who was still staring at the TV, as though nothing had changed. The babysitter thought it was odd, but brushed it off. Maybe the child had been watching too many spooky shows before bed. But the unease lingered in her chest. She made her way into the kitchen to grab a snack, the noise from the TV filling the background. But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it, a faint creak from the front door, the door that was supposed to be locked. She turned quickly, her heart racing, thinking the parents had returned early. But when she glanced through the living room window, there was no car in the driveway. The house was as still as before. She dismissed it, telling herself it was probably just the wind. Yet, as she moved down the hallway to check on the child, the air seemed to grow heavier. The faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, but when she stopped to listen, it was only the sound of her own heartbeat. When she reached the hallway, something caught her attention. It was a reflection in the mirror. She saw herself walking toward the child's room, but then something else moved in the background. A shadow, darker than the rest of the house, slipped behind her reflection, barely visible, but enough to make her pulse quicken. She turned quickly, her breath catching in her throat, but when she looked back, there was no one there. Her heart skipped a beat. She stood there for a moment, trying to gather herself, but her mind raced with confusion. Was she just imagining things? Was it the stress of the night playing tricks on her? The child, meanwhile, had stopped watching TV. She stood by the doorway, her eyes wide and frightened. "I was told not to trust her," the little girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "She's not who she says she is." The words sent a chill down the sitter's spine. Was it a warning, or was the child simply scared? She tried to calm the girl, asking her what she meant, but the child said nothing further. Her eyes, however, were fixed on something just beyond the babysitter, something she couldn't see. And then, as if on cue, there was another creak, this time from the hallway behind her. It was louder than before, followed by soft footsteps, slow and deliberate. The babysitter's heart began to race. She turned to face the hallway, expecting to see someone, maybe an intruder who had somehow snuck in unnoticed. But there was no one there. Nothing but the shadows of the house, stretching longer as the lights flickered overhead. Then, the door behind her, the front door, clicked shut. The sound was sharp and final, and as she approached it to check, she found it locked. But she was sure it had been open moments ago. She turned, her breath coming in short bursts as she scanned the room. The footsteps had stopped, but she still felt the weight of something or someone watching her. Her body tensed as she realized that she was alone in the house, or so she thought. The door behind her, the one leading to the backyard, clicked shut on its own. The locks turned, the sound reverberating through the walls, trapping her inside. The babysitter backed away from the door, but the footsteps returned, closer now, coming toward her. But when she turned to face them, there was nothing. She wasn't alone anymore. It was supposed to be a simple job. A quiet night in a secluded house, caring for a child whose parents had left for a few hours. A young woman, new to babysitting, was hired to look after a baby in a house at the edge of town, far from the bustling streets. The parents, kind but distant, gave her a brief tour of the home and then left, assuring her that everything would be just fine. But something felt off. The house was old, too old, As she stepped inside, the first thing she noticed was the smell. A faint, musty odor lingered in the air, like something had been locked away for years. The wooden floors creaked underfoot with each step, and the walls, lined with dark, faded wallpaper, seemed to close in around her. The nursery, where the child slept, was just down the hall, its door slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. She settled into the living room, trying to make herself comfortable, but there was no denying the strange stillness that filled the house. It felt like it was holding its breath. And then she heard it. A sound, faint at first, coming from the baby monitor. A soft giggle. The baby, barely a year old, was still asleep in its crib, or so she thought. She stood up, peering at the monitor. But the baby remained motionless, as if frozen in time. A strange feeling washed over her, something she couldn't quite put into words. The giggle continued, but it was no longer a playful sound. It was unsettling. The laughter grew louder, almost as if the baby was laughing at something in the room. The sitter turned and glanced at the nursery door, which was now wide open, a shadow flickering across the hallway. Thud. The sound came from upstairs. She froze. Her heart began to race. She had only just gotten settled, and yet the house seemed different. Was it the wind or something else? She decided to check on the baby. The monitor was still picking up the soft, eerie giggling, but now there was another sound, a whisper. Barely audible at first, it was a low murmur that sent chills up her spine. She slowly approached the nursery, her footsteps quiet, almost as if the house itself was trying to keep her from moving forward. As she stepped inside, she felt an immediate drop in temperature. The room seemed colder, the air heavier, like something was pressing against her chest. And then she heard it, a faint whispering coming from the corner of the room. "She sees you." The baby was still in its crib, but now it was staring at the corner of the room with wide, unblinking eyes. The sitter's breath caught in her throat. There was no one else in the room. The whispering continued, growing louder now, swirling around her as though the very walls themselves were speaking. Suddenly, a shadow passed by the window, flickering, as if something was moving just outside. She rushed to the window, her heart pounding in her chest, but found nothing. The street outside was empty, the darkness swallowing up the yard. She turned back to the room, her mind racing. The whispers had stopped, but the air was thick with tension. The baby was still staring at the corner, its eyes wide and fixed, as though it was looking at something, or someone, that was beyond her reach. She moved closer to the crib, trying to calm herself, but her eyes were drawn to something on the far wall, a family portrait. She hadn't noticed it before. It was old, the edges yellowed with age, the faces in the frame obscured by dust. As she wiped away the grime, her eyes went wide. In the portrait, there was a child, but it wasn't the same child in the crib. This one had a dark, hollow gaze. Its eyes seemed to follow her, locking onto hers, unblinking. The sitter's breath caught in her throat as she realized something. This child was staring directly at her. Not the child she was watching over, but the one in the picture. Before she could turn away, the whisper came again, closer now, right behind her. Her name is Evelyn. Her skin went cold. Her head spun as she tried to process the words. She spun around, her heart thudding in her chest. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure she couldn't quite make out. The room was too dark. The air seemed to hold its breath once more, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The door slammed shut behind her, and the whispers filled her ears, now a cacophony of voices. What would you do if you were in her shoes? Would you confront whatever's in that room? Or would you run? Each of these stories leaves us with a haunting mystery, with no easy answers, and no way to escape the questions they raise. But the truth is, these true babysitting horror stories are far from over. There are countless others just as terrifying, each more unsettling than the last. And in our next video, we'll bring you more spine-chilling accounts of those who found themselves in terrifying situations, watching over children they couldn't understand, in homes that weren't what they seemed. So stay tuned. We'll explore even more horrifying encounters that will leave you questioning whether you're ever truly alone. If these stories left you with chills down your spine, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another terrifying tale. We'll keep bringing you the most spine-chilling true horror stories that will keep you up at night. And don't forget to leave a like if you want more unsettling stories to haunt your thoughts. Share this video with others who dare to listen, and let us know in the comments which story left you the most disturbed.